Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Fox with SCAG. Thank you for joining us today for Toolbox Tuesday. Today's session is entitled Preserving Affordable Homes in Community Growth Areas. SCAG recognizes the importance of preserving affordable housing within our region, including both expiring use restrictions on subsidized housing and unsubsidized development. This includes supporting anti-displacement and tenant protection strategies and the preservation of at-risk properties identified in local housing elements. It also includes maintaining affordability of housing near job and activity centers and SCAG's priority growth areas, which are incorporated into SCAG's regional transportation plan, sustainable community strategies. Again, I'm Steve Fox. I'm moderating this session. I'm a senior regional planner at SCAG. I also with SCAG, I have Lyle Janicek with us today, who's presenting, and Linda Wheaton of SCAG, who's co-moderating with myself. Next slide. Some housekeeping items. We are scheduled for 1 hour and a half today. We are recording this meeting. All participant lines will be muted during the presentations. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the 4 presentations. If you do have a question, please type it into the chat box and we will monitor it and record it. Resource information on some of the links are included on slides on some of the subject matter that we're talking about today. Again, we're being recorded, and then we'll have the PowerPoint and the recording up on the SCAG Toolbox Tuesday website in the near future. And a link will be sent to all the registrants after the event today. Next slide. So going over the agenda today, we have 4 main presentations. The first covering preservation needs within our region, applicable state and federal laws and resources. Towards that end, we have Danielle Mozilla of the California Housing Partnership Corporation. Then we're going to talk about recent acquisition and preservation activities. And we have Roberto Carlos Garcia Ceballos, and he's with the Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre, the Los Angeles Community Land Trust Coalition, and the California Community Land Trust Network. Then we'll talk about state preservation coalition efforts. We have Carolyn McCormick of Enterprise Community Partners. And then we will look at SCAG's regional development platform tools to help our cities and partners and stakeholders. And Lyle Janicek of SCAG will be presenting that, followed by, as I mentioned earlier, question and answering, and then adjournment. Next slide. We have a participant poll we'd like you to participate in, just to give us an idea of who's attending today. And if you can please participate in the poll, and we'll give it a couple minutes, see. Okay, thank you. We have a large majority who have participated. So we have representation, 58% of attendees from local government, affordable housing developers, 6% housing advocate or other, community-based organization, 8%, and the other category at 27%. Ed, can you scroll down for the question number 2?
You have to enlarge the window.
Oh, I enlarge it. Okay. So we have, which of the following are you most interested in? Preservation of existing affordable housing with expiring affordability restrictions, 8%. Acquisition and preservation of affordability of existing unregulated housing, 13%, and large majority interested in both of those subjects. Next slide. About SCAG, for those who are not that familiar with SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments, we are a metropolitan planning organization. We are the largest in the nation, both in land area as well as population. We handle 197 jurisdictions in our area, including 6 counties that you can see there, and 191 cities, including tribal governments as well. One of the main things we do is our regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy, which we update every 4 years, the last one having been adopted in 2020. Next slide, please. What is Connect SoCal? What is our RTP-SCS long-term vision and investment framework? We go out to a horizon year. It's going to be 2050 for the next RTP-SCS that we are just beginning to get underway preparing, the 2024 RTP-SCS. We have project development patterns for the 6-county region, all those jurisdictions. Integrated regional development pattern transportation network, all the projects that the 6 counties and cities are programming in our next plan. Again, we update it every 4 years, and it's supported by SCAG's regional data platform. Next slide. So for the next round of state REAP funding, SCAG is currently developing a programmatic framework. A draft component of this is called the Housing Supportive Infrastructure Program. It's in its draft form right now. In addition to utilities supporting housing development, we have the three listed proposed priority areas that we want to concentrate on, including for funding, preservation of expiring covenants and naturally occurring affordable housing, housing trust funds, and technical assistance to our stakeholders and jurisdictions in our area. For more information on that, we have a link there at the bottom. Next slide. And with that, I can turn it over to our first presenter, Danielle Mozilla, with the California Housing Partnership. Danielle.
Great, thank you, Steve. Next slide. So yeah, Danielle Mozilla, the Senior Research Manager of the California Housing Partnership. For those of you who aren't familiar with the California Housing Partnership, we are a statewide nonprofit that conducts research to inform policy and legislation, as well as providing technical assistance to nonprofit partners and local agencies. Next slide. Today, I'm going to cover the following topics, ranging from unsubsidized affordable housing, at-risk subsidized affordable housing, and laws to preserve affordable housing, as well as affirmatively furthering fair housing. Next slide. In our latest statewide at-risk report, we published our findings on the number of unsubsidized affordable or naturally occurring affordable housing in California. In the 6-county SCAG region, there are nearly 577,000 homes that we consider unsubsidized affordable, which represents more than half of the inventory that exists in California. In the SCAG region, as you can see here in the map, Los Angeles County accounts for more than 2/3 of this inventory, while Ventura and Imperial counties make up less than 2%. Next slide. And for our research purposes, we define unsubsidized affordable housing as commercial apartment buildings with 5 or more units that have rents that are affordable to households earning 80% of area median income or below, with at least half of the units having rents at that affordability level. We consider rent affordable if the households spend less than 30% of their income on rent. So for example, in Orange County, an affordable rent for a 2-person household earning 80% of area median income, which is around $86,000 annually, would be $2,151 a month. In San Bernardino County, this would look like a household earning around $50,000 annually, with a monthly rent of $1,265 a month. Next slide. As part of that at-risk report, we annually analyzed the subsidized affordable rental stock and found that more than 16,000 affordable homes were at risk of converting to market rate over the next 10 years in the SCAG region, and that the number of at risk in the region comprises a little more than half of the affordable homes at risk in the state. Developments at risk are concentrated in Los Angeles County, which also has a large proportion of the subsidized housing stock overall. This subsidized inventory includes developments subsidized and or assisted by HUD project-based rental assistance contracts and loans, grants and loans from HCD and CalHFA, low-income housing tax credits, USDA Section 514 and 515 loans and rental assistance, and a portion of locally subsidized developments predominantly funded through former redevelopment agencies. As you can see here in the SCAG region, 59% of what is at risk are HUD project-based rental assistance contracts or maturity loans, 22% are expiring low-income housing tax credits, and 16% are locally subsidized or otherwise restricted. Next slide. Our risk assessment is divided into 3 categories. We characterize them as very high, high, and moderate risk. In the SCAG region, what falls under is high risk, or one may lose affordability in the next 5 to 5 years, represents the majority of these 16,000 affordable homes at risk. Next slide. Here is a very brief summation of our risk assessment as we apply it to the state. Very high risk developments are those that may lose affordability in the next year. High risk developments may lose affordability in the next 1 to 5 years, and moderate risk is in the next 5 to 10. Our analysis also takes ownership into the account, and a development may have reduced risk of conversion regardless of expiring affordability if it is owned by a stable, mission-driven owner or public agency. Next slide. So in California, laws require jurisdictions to take certain actions related to preserving existing subsidized housing as part of the housing element process. This includes monitoring an inventory of what developments are at risk of losing affordability, what strategies and financial resources are available to facilitate the acquisition of these developments, and to conduct an analysis on how much it would cost to replace lost developments with new subsidized homes, or acquire and or rehabilitate existing developments. Next slide. For existing subsidized rental developments in California, we have a state preservation notice law, which outlines the rights and responsibilities of owners, tenants, affected public entities, and certified qualified entities as it relates to the expiration of affordability or sale of these developments. Under this law, owners are to send notices to tenants and affected public agencies such as the local government, the local housing authority, and HCD 1 year before affordability expires, and again at 6 months. Tenants and prospective tenants are given an additional 3-year notice before affordability ends. If an owner decides to sell the development, a notice of opportunity to submit an offer to purchase the development must be sent to certified qualified entities concurrent with the 1-year notice. In the first 6 months, owners can only accept bona fide offers from qualified entities. And in the last 6 months, offers can be made by other entities, but qualified entities must be given right of first refusal. More details around the provisions of the law can be found on HCD's website linked here. Next slide. So in terms of affirmatively furthering fair housing, it is addressed in federal and state laws requiring public agencies through assessment of fair housing to take meaningful actions that, taken together, address significant disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity. Strategies for preservation and revitalization of affordable housing and protection against displacement support these objectives. For more information on both the federal and state requirements, both are linked here for HUD and HCD. Next slide. Lastly, I wanted to share a few additional resources the California Housing Partnership offers. We have an affordable housing map and benefits calculator that looks you look up subsidized developments in your jurisdiction and see the related economic and social benefits of those developments. The figures I cited earlier in the presentation can be found in our 2022 Affordable Homes at Risk report with the associated breakdowns for each county, and also includes figures related to unsubsidized affordable developments. And lastly, on the far right, we recently released a policy brief called Who Can Afford to Rent, where we examined affordability by county by analyzing which percentage of area median income was needed to afford average rents. Next slide. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Next slide. Next, we'll talk about implementation of the Los Angeles County CLT pilot program. You're on, Roberto.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Roberto Garcia Ceballos. I'm the co-director of Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre. My contact information is here, and Fideicomiso is a member of the Los Angeles Community Land Trust Coalition, which I'll be talking about the work we're doing in LA County. But we're also members of the California Community Land Trust Network. Can we go to the next slide? So Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre is a fairly new organization. We were founded in 2018 to address the disinvestment and gentrification or reinvestment of funds that are harmful to our community. And the idea is to create an alternative for folks to be able to, for neighborhoods to be able to secure community control and community ownership through a community land trust model. And so if we could go to the next slide. And Fideicomiso is not the only organization that's working on this sort of work. In the last 3 years, we've seen more community land trusts growing in the LA region. And so we have El Sereno Community Land Trust, Liberty Community Land Trust, as new community land trusts like Fideicomiso within the last 3 years, with Beverly, Vermont Community Land Trust and Trust South LA being community land trusts that existed prior to 3 years ago. Can we go to the next slide, please? The LA CLT Coalition has worked together to advance our collective capacities across the county. And so things we've done together is fundraise $3 million within the last 2 years to hire staff and to work with each other to acquire properties, and most specifically, set aside funds for collective work and shared resources. And some of the things that we're exploring is like advocacy efforts, but also like how do we share property management and real estate development capacities throughout the region. Can we go to the next slide? And most importantly, our coalition is really thinking about the, excuse me one second. Most importantly, our coalition is really thinking about how to create large scale structural changes in terms of like how do we really start addressing unjust and racist practices, specifically around land use and housing justice. And so for us, we think the community land trust is critical in terms of implementing. And so for us, we need to make sure that low and moderate income people are taken care of in terms of having wealth to turn over to other generations. And for us, thinking of how the community land trust could be a model for homeownership. We want to make sure that we prevent and stop any displacement efforts that the speculative market and gentrification are causing in our neighborhoods. And we want to make sure that we have resources and capacity to really be resilient during market downturns or crises like the ones we've seen in 2008. And then we really just want, and most importantly, we want to promote grassroots participation and decision-making on a local level in our neighborhoods. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And two of our big successes within the last 2 years have been that we've been able to pass and work with the County of LA Board of Supervisor offices to create programs for CLTs to be able to acquire land and housing. And the first one was in September 2020, where we got the Chapter 8 tax defaulted properties to be turned over to CLTs. This is a much slower program, and I won't focus on it. I'll mostly focus on what happened in November 2020, which that program was expanded in where $14 million were allocated for all 5 CLTs to acquire buildings across the county. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk more about that program. So the program was designated for community land trusts to acquire small multifamily units in that what we call NOAA at the LA CLT Coalition, the Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing. The program set the guideline of us having to spend $150,000 to $350,000 per unit, and that we would focus at spending no more than $50,000 per unit in rehab costs. The properties needed to be concentrated near transit, no more than 5.5 miles away. And we needed to have engagement with tenants, specifically tenants that are at risk of being displaced. And in terms of how that was defined, we worked really closely with the county, specifically LACDET, for them to create those guidelines for us. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in other slides. And the household incomes needed to be within the 30 to 80% area median income for the county, and needed to be within the AMI, the 30 to 80 AMI. And for us, you know, we were really glad about that, because that's the type of population that we are targeting as well. And so the county identified displacement risk areas, specifically using displacement maps. They took into consideration like investment that's happening in neighborhoods. I think they use tax credits and other community planning tools to identify what a displacement risk area. And further on the presentation, we'll look at it more. And then we needed to acquire these properties within and they really prioritized that we work within the unincorporated LA County, and that they not be too close to freeways. So these partnerships, so the community land trusts, like I said, are fairly new organizations. And so we did a lot of work to build the infrastructure in the region. And one of the things that we did is that we partnered with Spark LA, which is a national funder, to bring in $500,000 of recoverable grant money, additional to the 14 million, for us to be able to do due diligence on acquiring each property. We worked with county council to create the grant agreement and monitor the grant as well. And most importantly, we built really strong partnerships with community development corporations. And so El Sereno Community Land Trust worked with Habitat for Humanity in San Gabriel Valley. Fideicomiso worked with Little Tokyo Service Center, in a neighboring, Beverly Vermont Community Land Trust worked with the statewide community development corporation called Brilliant Corners. Liberty CLT worked with Venice Community Housing, which is another CDC, and Trust South LA worked with Habitat for Humanity, Greater Los Angeles. So if we go to the next slide. And so this is how our pilot program worked out in terms of implementation. So we formed our CDC CLT partnerships. We secured public subsidy like the 14 millions, but we also secured public, non-public funding through working with Spark and our partnership with Genesis LA to make sure that we were able to have funds to do due diligence and compete in the housing market, because a lot of these properties we were working based on the housing market. And through the partnerships that we had, we were able to do a lot of community engagement to be able to set aside and identify the pipeline. We worked with LACTA to make sure that we had the correct guidelines in terms of how to identify properties. And once we've identified properties, we had all the tools we needed to acquire and make offers and move forward. And the idea, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, but a lot of the ways we acquired properties were not just like the CLTs being the sole owners in partnership with the county, but that we really had to be innovative in the way we set up the way the acquisitions were going to happen. But we'll go over that in a bit, but let me show you some of the results of the pilot program. If we could go to the next slide. So here, so the original goals were that we needed to acquire 5+ properties. As of last month, we were able to spend all the money and we were able to acquire 8 properties. The purchase price needed to be within 150 to 350 per unit. Our average acquisition price was $241 per unit. Our rehab costs our average rehab cost was maintained at $50,593 within what the goals were. And we were able to work with the county to adjust what we considered small multifamily. Initially, it was 4 to 20 units, but we did acquire a 2-unit building through the program. And the largest building was 11 units. And then all properties were within 0.5 miles from a transit stop. Most of the 2 of the properties had tenants that were organized and were part of the acquisition. But the other properties, the CLTs leveraged their relationships and expertise in the community to make sure that there was some sort of contact and relationship with the tenants prior to acquiring. And this is like one of my favorite parts, but through all our acquisitions, the average AMI is at 49%, which for us, it just shows how important it is to stabilize these buildings, because we're seeing that a lot of low-income folks are living there, and it's the population that we want to work with in terms of stabilizing and making sure they have a permanent home. If we could go to the next slide. And unfortunately, you can't see this, but it will get fixed during our, when we send out materials. But it shows like all the acquisitions that we did, all 8 acquisitions. You know, Fideicomiso and Little Tokyo working in East LA. We had the largest building, which was 11 units. And our average affordability level of AMI was at 50%. And then we have Beverly, Vermont, that worked with Brilliant Corners in the Wilshire area in Supervisor District 2. And they had their average affordability level at 40 AMI. And so it just goes down the list in terms of how successful this program was. In terms of displacement, vulnerability index score, LACTA, their index score uses census tracts to kind of set the moderate, high, and high risk of displacement. And the index uses property of ownership information at a parcel level. It also uses demographic and economic data at the census tract to assess risk of residential instability. And it's measured between the executed sales agreements and escrow close. And so that's how we were able to kind of know the displacement vulnerability index score. And in our in our findings through this program, we're able to see that we've mostly worked in high-risk neighborhoods. And so on the next slide, we're not only working to stabilize, acquire and stabilize buildings, but we're also thinking about the long-term stewardship of the buildings. And so for us, we worked with CDCs to acquire the buildings. In some instances, the COT by itself was able to acquire the building without any need of the CDC to be incorporated into the grant agreement and into forming an LLC or a limited liability company together. And they just consult with their CDC around rehab needs and property management or asset management needs. In other instances, the COT and the CDC jointly formed an LLC to own the improvements, and the COT by itself owns the land. And then in another model, there's a joint LLC where the COT and the CDC are holding the improvements in the land. And these structures, some of them are temporary because we're also thinking about the conversion of the buildings in terms of having the tenants have a stake in terms of ownership or decision-making over the improvements. And so in some of the examples that we're thinking through or models that we're thinking through, the COT will be the sole owner of the improvements in land and will engage the tenants in ways to be consulted. But in other models, folks are thinking of forming limited equity cooperatives where those limited equity cooperatives would own the improvements while the COT would own the land. And another kind of fusion of the first option and the second option is that some sort of nonprofit tenant association, like a mutual housing association that are very popular in New York, would hold the improvements while the land would be held by the COT. So those are kind of like the things we're thinking through in terms of long-term ownership of the buildings. But currently we're on my left side of the ownership structures of like where it says acquisition and rehab period. So all of us are still in that period where we all kind of fall within one of these models. And so that's it. That's how the implementation of this pilot program is going. We are really excited to announce that there's 2 really important reports coming out to know more about this COT pilot program at the county level. We're currently working with Liberty Hill, LaSalle partners to come out with an independent report of the implementation that we had. Next slide, please. Sorry. And so we're really excited, and we plan to launch it in June of 2022. But also LACTA and the county is coming out with their report. And so it's going to be really great. It's going to be a lot of information that's going to be accessible to the public and specifically to the Southern California and California region in terms of how do we create programs like this at scale. And so if you want to stay in touch with us, you could follow us at our website, which is fectl.la. You could also find us on Instagram at fectl_2019. And just make sure you visit the California Community Land Trust Network website at cacltnetwork.org. And so thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Next slide. Okay, next we have preservation policy funding capacity building with Carolyn McCormick.
Everyone, I'm excited to be here. I'm Caroline McCormack with Enterprise Community Partners. You can go to the next slide. I'm going to focus most of this presentation on talking about sort of statewide policy and funding coming down the line for preservation. Specifically, I'm based in our Northern California office, but increasingly our preservation, our work is expanding beyond Northern California to also be Southern California. And so I just want to acknowledge that I also have a teammate based in the Enterprise Socal office, Elizabeth Richards, that you may be familiar with, who leads that from our end, but I'll be kind of talking to sort of the statewide framework. just real quickly going through like what Enterprise does. Enterprise is a community development financial institution with a charge to increase the supply of affordable housing, advance racial equity, and build resilience and upward mobility. And you can go to the next slide. And we do that in a number of ways. You probably have heard of us through our work as a tax credit investor. That's kind of our bread and butter, is providing capital for LIHTC deals, but we also have a whole policy team that works to advance affordable housing policies, as well as a grant making team and sort of a community development arm. So just wanted to kind of name our role there. You can go to the next slide. And really, we came to the preservation space because of many of the things that Danielle brought up, many of the sort of statistics around the majority of low-income Californians live in unsubsidized affordable housing, and especially as state resources to create new housing become more competitive and more scarce, we several years ago made the decision to really focus on what we call unsubsidized affordable housing. And there's a number of key challenges that we see sort of facing this particular housing stock. Number one, given the loss of thousands of units a year of unsubsidized affordable housing, we really need to find a perm source subsidy to stem the tide of displacement of primarily Black and Brown communities across the state. And there is no sort of statewide financing tool currently available. I'll talk about some opportunities to get us there. Another thing that we're really focused on at Enterprise is building up the developer capacity. You know, unlike the new construction side and sort of the LIHTC affordable housing development ecosystem, we don't have a really networked and deep bench of resources for developers who are getting into the preservation space. And so we're really focused on trying to find touch points to build the developer capacity, especially as many orgs are getting into the space sort of new to development. And so wanting to make sure that there's sort of TAing capacity building opportunities paired with some of these resources coming down the line. And then at Enterprise, we also worry about sort of the long-term asset management of these properties. Before I joined Enterprise 6 months ago, I was running the acquisition rehab program for the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Housing. And that's one thing we grappled with as we looked at our sort of AC rehab portfolio. Is, you know, you've got relatively small projects often scattered across a large geographic area, and really wanting to make sure that the developers and the tenants who live in the buildings are set up for success and sort of the long-term plan for these properties. And I'll kind of skip past the opportunities since I'm going to dive deeper into some of those capital resources coming down the line. So you can go to the next slide. This is kind of showing the breadth of our work. I won't spend too much time on here, but I'll be focusing again on sort of the policy and capacity building pieces of Enterprise's sort of preservation body of work. You can go to the next slide. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is a sort of real opportunity that is a piece of legislation that passed last year in July 2021. This is the Foreclosure Intervention Housing Preservation Program. This is a $500 million program to acquire and rehab unsubsidized affordable housing at risk of foreclosure. So this is an HCD program. HCD is required to contract with a fund manager. So the funds will be flowing through a sort of main fund manager and a network of implementing fund managers to actually get the funds out the door. But the sort of sphere of projects we're talking about here is buildings at risk of foreclosure that fall between 1 and 25 units. This was an effort led by the Stable Homes California Coalition in partnership with the California CLT network. The CLTs really championed this piece of legislation, and we were successful in getting this as our first sort of statewide chunk of funding for preservation about a year ago. And we'll kind of talk timeline for these funds, but you can go to the next slide. So just a little bit more color to what FIP covers. So it's in terms of eligible borrowers, we're talking about nonprofit developers, CLTs, limited equity co-ops, tenants, and local governments as being eligible for this program. You do have to apply to be an eligible borrower. So I think the idea there is there's some pre-vetting that goes into the organizations in acknowledgement that, like, for preservation deals, you do have to move quickly to meet sort of the closing timelines, especially in hot markets. And so pre-qualifying borrowers to kind of act on those deals, affordability term, 30 years for ownership, 55 years for rental housing. This program is relatively sweeping in terms of what it will cover. There's sort of a couple of pots of money. There is a flexible pre-development funding pot that can cover sort of due diligence and deposits, not that are sort of at the deal level, but also just flexible. If a QMP is actually qualified, they can access funds for a project that might not even come to fruition, in acknowledgement that, like, in order to get your foot in the door on these deals, there's some amount of due diligence you would have to do, even if the deal doesn't come through, so that it sort of is very flexible on that sort of pre-development, pre-work financing. It also includes, as part of the package of financing, technical assistance and capacity building grants to actually hire staff and really at the organizational level build the capacity of the development orgs who are engaging in this work. So it's, I think, really an acknowledgement that a lot of the developers who will be using this program, many of them will be new, and that it's not just about the financing to make the deals work at the deal level. It's also sort of building up those development entities to be able to, act upon this work. You can go to the next slide. Just a bit more about the proposed funding limits and form. These came out via the draft program guidelines that came out just last Friday. But just I'm pretty impressed with the sort of eligible uses for the program. Again, covering up to 100% of the ACC rehab budget, max per unit funding of $450K. It covers operating reserves for low income households, allows the developers to capitalize up to 20 years of a reserve to make sure that those low income households remain stabilized. I just am pretty impressed by what the program is covering. Just wanting to note that there's a target geographic distribution that was laid out in the program guidelines, 45% of which is proposed to flow to Southern California. Next slide. So I just wanted to give the quick high level on the timeline. Draft guidelines came out on Friday. There's 1 month to comment on those and provide feedback. From there, HCD will put out an RFP for a fund manager, so likely a CDFI entity to kind of manage the deployment of those funds, and that fund manager will work with a network of other fund managers to make sure that they're reaching the developers in different parts of the state. And then separately, there'll be a TA provider RFP that will go out. And then by fall 2022, guidelines will be finalized, fund managers and TA providers will be in place, and then the program will launch in Q1 or Q2 of 2023. So that's really exciting. We're working in partnership with our friends at the California CLT network to make sure that this program is inclusive of developers CLT developers, as well as sort of more traditional affordable rental housing developers, to make sure that this program is successful. Next slide. Okay, so the next sort of statewide funding source is a TBD. It's actually pending current state budget negotiations. This is a bill that we're co-sponsoring. It's called the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program. Another $500 million request into the sort of budget negotiations to create a statewide long-term subsidy source for AC rehab deals. This particular pot of money is distinct from FIP in a couple ways. Number one, it's broader than projects at risk of foreclosure. And number two, it's much more broadly AC rehab, so not fitting just into the 1 to 25 unit bucket. It's much broader. And so that's the ongoing requests. Again, we're running this through the Stable Homes Coalition, which we co-lead with Public Advocates and Housing California. We've got about 85 different organizations signed on in support of this bill. We've got a number of assembly members and senators on board in SoCal. We've got Bloom, Quirk-Silva, Luz Rivas on the Assembly side, and Senate side, we've got Limon, Rubio, and Umberg really championing this to be funded through the historic budget surplus. So that's TBD. We'll know by July whether we were successful. In terms of structure, it'll look similar to FIP in some ways, in that it's acquisition, rehab, capital for long-term subsidy. I will say that it's a little more flexible in some ways, where there is the option that the program run through a fund manager, so CDFIs, but also written into the legislation is the flexibility for if a local government has their own existing preservation program and they wish to run their subsidy source through their own sort of existing infrastructure. We were very clear that, like, okay, there are existing programs, like in Northern California, we have San Francisco Small Sites Program, and Oakland has their program, and SoCal some local jurisdictions have their programs. So wanting to just align with those efforts and that infrastructure that already exists at the local level. CAP will also include funds for technical assistance. Same sort of concept of, like, how do we support the orgs who are doing this work beyond just sort of the capital. We're also focused on, like, the sort of long-term capacity building and sustainability of those organizations. And then, yeah, working in partnership with local governments as well as CDFIs to get these funds out the door. So if you're interested in signing on to that letter and want to know more about how you can support efforts to get these funds, and so we can get these out the door at the state level, feel free to reach out to me. Go to the next slide. One other thing I wanted to mention, it's still in development, but I mentioned that enterprise is really focused on, like, how do we also support developers in doing this work. And so our national team is launching an academy called Preservation Next, with the goal of how do we create a network of developers working in the preservation space and provide them with training, tools, access to TA, and sort of capacity building. And the first academy will actually be in California. And so in the coming months, maybe I can recirculate the application for that, but essentially we're trying to create a backbone to really do this work at the level that it needs to happen to stem the tide of displacement in California. And so we're going to be enrolling essentially developers in this program to help build up the development muscle on the preservation front. So I can share those resources. Next slide. That's kind of an overview of what our Preservation Academy will cover. I won't go in too deep of detail, just the FYI, and you can go to the next slide, which I think is just our contact information. So as I mentioned, I'm the lead on sort of the state work. In SoCal, Elizabeth Richards is leading kind of local preservation work efforts. And if you want to click the link, once you get this resource, there's a whole slew of different preservation related resources that Enterprise has launched recently. And with that, I will stop.
Great, next slide. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Lyle Janicek, and I'm an associate regional planner here at SCAG. I'm here to discuss several publicly available tools SCAG has to offer when it comes to understanding our region. Over the past several years, SCAG has worked to bring our regional databases to the forefront of policy and planning decision-making. Next slide, please. Today, I will be going over several resources that can be utilized to prioritize efforts for strategic planning and preservation practices. This presentation will provide several hyperlinks to our website and resources, and will be shared with attendees after today's webinar wraps up. We'll be going over SCAG's regional hub, the Socal Atlas, the helper tool, our parcel locator, and the LDX data and map book. I will also showcase other resources that highlight housing-related data sets for our region. So go ahead to go on to the next slide. First, I'd like to show you where much of our data can be found. So if you navigate over to SCAG's homepage, which is scag.ca.gov, the RDP or Regional Data Platform can be found as one of the top icons near the top right of the page. It is listed as RDP, so by clicking on this, you can access several of the resources and tools we will talk about today. Next slide. One of the tools you can find on the Regional Data Platform is the Socal Atlas. This tool is an interactive web mapping tool developed by SCAG that allows planners, residents, and other users to explore data across geographies and topics through a collection of web map and statistics. The tool leverages data primarily from the American Community Survey, or ACS, the U.S. Census Bureau Decennial Census, and ESRI. Related data is made available through the regional hub, and additional information regarding the platform can be found on SCAG's website. Topics for this tool include key indicators, housing, employment, COVID-19, and at-risk population information at a jurisdictional level. SCAG also has a parcel locator tool, which is a web mapping tool developed by SCAG to help local jurisdictions, residents, and other stakeholders find and explore information about individual parcels. The tool is principally based on updated, curated versions of parcel level land use datasets, which have been available through the regional hub. This data set provides parcel level information regarding building footprints, unbuilt square footages, grocery stores within 1 mile, healthcare facilities within 1 mile, as well as quantity of open space within 1 mile. Next slide. Another tool is the Housing Element Parcel Tool, or Helper, which is meant to help local jurisdictions and stakeholders understand local land use, site opportunities, and environmental sensitivities for aligning housing planning with the State Department of Housing and Community Development's 6th cycle housing element requirements. The tool is principally based on updated curated versions of parcel level land use data and other data sets, which help identify several different key characteristics like vacant land parcels, lower valued commercial retail, publicly owned land, parcels within priority growth areas or PDAs, outside of constrained areas, parcels outside environmentally sensitive areas, inside higher opportunity areas, inside environmental justice areas, as well as parcels that are located within specific proximity to services like schools, shopping centers, as well as healthcare. Next slide. In addition to many of these tools, SCAG has many resources to help understand planning through the context of housing. For example, each of SCAG's 191 cities and 6 counties have pre-certified local housing data. This data was developed by SCAG and pre-certified by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, for use in the 6th cycle housing elements. The reports contain a wide range of jurisdictional level data, elements intended to provide an understanding of housing needs, including demographic data, specialized housing needs, homelessness, housing stock characteristics, overpayment and overcrowding, and subsidized units at risk in developments. The data on assisted units at risk of conversion was developed from the California Housing Partnership, or CHP, and assesses the level of at risk to converting to market rate units by jurisdictional level. These data identify homes without a known overlapping subsidy that would extend affordability beyond the indicated timeframe, and unless otherwise noted, are not owned by a large, stable nonprofit or mission-driven developer. Next slide, please. To find out more information on identifying subsidized units at risk of conversion, you'll want to visit the links on the screen, which will also be shared alongside the rest of this presentation after today's webinar wraps up. For example, you'll want to scroll down to the section identified as 6th cycle housing element resources, where many of the resources discussed today are located. Here you can find out about the complete raw data and metadata regarding housing elements, which can be found there. Additionally, you'll find information regarding SCAG's regional accessory dwelling unit affordability analysis. SCAG conducted this analysis in order to provide local governments in the region with assumptions for ADU affordability that can be used to assign ADUs to income categories for the purpose of the 6th cycle housing element. Here you'll also find the housing needs data certification letter from the California Department of Housing and Community Development. This web page additionally provides the resources for the helper tool, which was previously discussed. And lastly, more information on local housing data is linked on this page as well. So next slide. Another resource SCAG has available is our data map book. This data map book and its dynamic online equivalent through the regional data platform is a specific document for each jurisdiction within the SCAG region and is designed to help local planners better understand the sources, methodologies, and contexts of data sets, which will be integrated into SCAG's regional plans. The layers shared with local jurisdictions in preparation for Connect Socal 2024. SCAG is seeking updates and corrections on several layers as indicated. Additional layers represent regional data sets, which these layers include land use, transportation, high quality transit areas, as well as the priority development areas, which we will go over on the next couple of slides. These are related to the regional objectives and included in this process to help prepare the forecasted regional development pattern of Connect SoCal 2024. Next slide. Oh. That is the slide of the land uses and categories defined in the data map book itself. So let's move on to the next slide. Each jurisdictional report covers several maps from several categories, including land use, priority development, transportation, green region resources, geographical boundaries, and growth. Under each of these categories, several specific layers and maps are developed to showcase local and regional planning concepts. The data map book includes local data as well as SCAG data. So for example, on the left side of the screen, you can see the general plan of the city of Culver City, which includes the local land use designation. And if Ed wants to press the space bar, we also provide it in a regional SCAG land use data code. So that way we are able to compare and contrast jurisdictions across the region as a whole. Next slide. As part of SCAG's process for developing our regional transportation plan, we've developed a methodology to determine where growth could occur based on several parameters. As a preliminary process for Connect SoCal 2024, SCAG has determined 4 specific areas to help encourage sustainable growth to help reduce greenhouse gas reduction. Formerly known as priority growth areas, Priority development areas use an overlapping process to highlight applicable areas for development based on neighborhood mobility areas, livable corridors, transit priority areas, and spheres of influence. Areas identified as PDAs have the potential to tap into grant funding that includes preservation strategies for at-risk developments. The following slides will briefly touch on some of these PDAs, which are overlapped on this screen. So next slide. On the left is the neighborhood mobility areas, which focus on creating, improving, restoring, and enhancing safe and convenient connections to schools, hospitals, shopping, services, places of worship, parks, greenways, and other destinations. SCAG's objective is to develop a region-wide map of neighborhood mobility to help further strategies and policies within Connect SoCal 2024. NMAs are developed using 4 measures. These are based on intersection density, low-speed streets, land use entropy, and accessibility to amenities within 1 mile using street network densities. The livable corridor strategy on the right encourages local jurisdictions to plan and zone for increased density at nodes along key corridors and to redevelop single-story underperforming retail with well-designed higher density housing and employment centers. Growth at strategic nodes along key corridors, many of which are within high quality transit areas, will make transit a more convenient and viable option. Livable corridor strategy is comprised of 3 components that will encourage context sensitivity, improve retail performance, combat disinvestment, and improve fiscal outcomes for local communities. These areas include transit improvements, active transportation improvements, as well as land use policies. Next slide. For Connect SoCal 2024, SCAG developed 2020, SCAG developed high quality transit areas within the SCAG region for the plan year of 2045. HQTAs are priority development areas within 1/2 mile of an existing or planned fixed guideway transit stop or a bus transit corridor where buses pick up passengers at a frequency of every 15 minutes or less during peak commuting hours. Freeway transit corridors with no bus stops on the freeway alignment do not have a directly associated HQTA. On the right is an example of TPAs or transit priority areas. These are priority development areas that are within 1/2 mile of existing or planned major transit stops in the region. Major transit stop is defined as a site containing an existing or planned rail or bus rapid transit station, a ferry terminal served by either a bus or rail transit service, or the intersection of 2 or more major bus routes with a frequency of service interval of 15 minutes or less during the morning and afternoon peak commutes. Next slide, please. In addition to all of these online resources, SCAG has developed the Local Information Services Team, or LIST. This technical assistance program was developed to help our jurisdictions coordinate, plan, and develop a system to link SCAG's value-added products to help address local information needs, deliver technical assistance, and provide local staff an opportunity to offer feedback on how SCAG can improve our products to facilitate better collaboration, both regionally and locally. If you are interested in technical assistance of any kind, please reach out to the LIST team at list@scag.ca.gov, or you may submit a request on the RDP Regional Hub at the website linked in the screen. And with that, I will hand it back over to our moderator, Steve Fox, as that wraps up my section of the program.
Thank you, Lyle, and thanks again to all of our presenters today. We have the balance of our time today for question and answers, so please ask away. Is anything in the chat room? Linda?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Linda Wheaton. I don't see any questions in the chat right now that we haven't answered, but we want to thank our presenters for having identified, first of all, resources for how to identify projects that are both existing subsidized developments that may be at risk of conversion to market rate, and unsubsidized units that may also be at risk. So we're very cognizant that these represent very important existing resources that we can't afford to lose, and is important for protecting tenants continued occupancy and anti-displacement efforts. These kind of efforts are extremely important with regard to affirmatively furthering fair housing and other planning objectives that our public agencies and advocacy groups are working on. So there's, as you can see, as we've heard, there are a lot of, there are developing statewide resources and advocacy for resources for protecting this important stock. I see a question in the chat for Lyle asking if there's a direct link to find the data map books for the cities. We have indicated that we will. Lyle has just included it, but when the slides are posted and you will all be sent a link to the slides, we have included hyperlinks to all of the resources that we have described today.
Yep. And so, Jonathan, if you want that link I just dropped in the chat, we'll take you to kind of our landing page, and we have it broken down by county. And then you would select the particular city you're interested, or we even have the Imperial, like for example, Imperial County has their own data set as well.
Let's see. So someone is asking Roberto about the $50,000 cap on rehab expenses and how you showed how very close you kept to that cap. Roberto, can you elaborate on how that worked and how, if the properties have to continue, have additional rehab needs beyond what you were able to spend?
Yeah, I think the 50,000 cap was using the county funds. And yeah, I know that some of the buildings didn't even use some of the rehab money, some of the money for rehab, but for us, we were able to secure a 0 interest loan through the nonprofit finance fund. Or we're still working in securing a 0 interest loan for the next 3 years with the nonprofit finance fund. And that's been helpful for us. So to be able to continue our rehab efforts. And so I think the CLTs are also working with financial institutions and CDFIs to come up with the remaining funds to be able to rehab the buildings.
Yeah, those are, yeah, I'm sure that's a challenge, especially depending on the age and the condition of a lot of those properties.
Yeah,
Lyle, someone has a question for how to correct housing a high quality transit area map.
Yeah, hi, Holly. I see your question in the chat. And so what we are currently doing is the HQTA layer is developed from SCAG data as well as coordination with the county transportation commissions. And so it depends because the buffer of it, if there's a point, that is the intersection of either a peak period of either a fixed or planned fixed stop, and then there's usually about a half-mile buffer around it. We are currently also requesting feedback on this as part of our local data exchange program, which is open from now until December. So all jurisdictions will have an opportunity to provide comments, specifically the one that you even mentioned, you can bring to our attention as part of this feedback loop. So I know we just recently sent out information about it to all of our local jurisdictions planning directors and city managers, and hopefully that will be filtered down the line. But we do have like an online platform where you can provide feedback regarding specific data like that. So, and that is also part of our list training. So if cities and jurisdictions would like specific training on how to complete that kind of feedback, list will be providing that. So.
Thank you. Danielle, a questioner has asked if you can elaborate on the methodology that you use for identifying at-risk unsubsidized NOAA properties.
Sure. Can participants talk? I don't know which piece would be helpful to talk more about?
This is
Ed, can you unmute Hillary if you can
Hillary.
identify her?
Can you unmute Hillary?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi, Danielle. Yeah, this is Hillary Carter. I was just wondering how your methodology for identifying, both NOAA properties that don't have any, covenants on them in a region that are not subsidized.
So we house a statewide preservation database that tracks a long list that I sort of rattled off earlier of state and federal and some locally subsidized developments. And so we went through an extensive process looking at what other multifamily buildings exist, deduplicating the ones we know have existing subsidies, and also meet the other parameters in terms of being what are their average asking rents? Are they below the threshold at which we've set? And that's sort of how we've come to the number we used in that report.
Can I just say that? Can I say something about that?
Sure.
That-
Roberto, yes.
Yeah, I think Danielle's use of stats is really helpful, and for folks who are working in a maybe smaller capacity, I think, and I'll speak on Fideicomiso, is that we're a pretty small scale organization, and so for us it was like really important to identify the neighborhood that we wanted to work with, and visually. At least here in East LA and Boyle Heights, it's very apparent that buildings are being sold and flipped dramatically. And so for us, it was important to engage in the market. And so a quick research of small multifamily building, like if you Google small multifamily buildings being sold in the neighborhood, you're going to get a lot of those buildings. And for us, it was really important to have partnerships with tenant rights organizations that were going into the buildings. One, to support the tenants in applying for ERAP as a really important tool, but also to give context around what are the tenant rights during the pandemic. And that gave us a lot of information and data around folks' AMIs or incomes, like habitability, like how the living standards were in the buildings. And it really sets up a really important campaign around stabilization and preserving tenants in the neighborhoods that you're specifically working in. And so I highly also recommend these sort of partnerships with tenant rights organizations that could really work hand in hand with affordable housing developers to see not only to stabilize tenants, but also to understand the market in terms of how it's playing out on a day-to-day basis.
So Roberto, someone has also asked about whether any tenant organizations have approached your organization about acquiring the properties.
Yeah, so we're currently working with a 50-unit multifamily building that we also collaborated with a tenant rights organization, multiple tenant rights organizations, because 10 of those units were being evicted unjustly. And so for us, it was really important to kind of work with other tenant rights organizations to intervene and stop those evictions. And so now we have an ongoing relationship with the building, and as the resources that were mentioned today, like FIP, CAP, and then we were really hoping for the expansion of this funding source through the COT pilot program to see which of those funding sources could fit in terms of acquiring this building. So in a lot of ways, that's how it's currently playing out, at least in East LA and Boyle Heights. And we also go out and do ongoing engagement and outreach to tenants who live in buildings that are being sold.
Okay. Danielle, Holly has raised a question about why you call properties at risk of becoming unaffordable in 30 years, for example. She comments that it seems that it's certain to become unaffordable in 30 years. If that was the original term of the use restrictions. So she suggests that it's not at risk, but it's certain unless you can modify the contract.
So Holly, I apologize if I misspoke, but we don't analyze risk in the next 30 years. We look at it in the 10-year horizon. But in terms of developments becoming unaffordable, a lot can happen, and obviously a lot of it is driven by owner motivation in the market in terms of what can extend affordability of a development. You'll have, for those who are familiar with the low-income housing tax credit program, many of you know that a lot of times developments will go in to resyndicate and would thus extend the affordability of that development past the initial 30 years, or what is commonplace now is the 55 years, and extend it for another 55. For the HUD, project-based rental assistance contracts, a lot of times owners will continue and renew said contracts for another 5, 10, or 20 years. So that is one of the reasons why we look at a 10-year horizon for planning purposes, for resource purposes, but a lot can happen between now and whenever that affordability covenant may expire.
Do we have any other questions for any of the presenters? So Steve, it looks like we're ready to wrap up for the day, and remind folks that we will be sending a link to the presentation with access to the resources. I don't know, probably within a week or so.
Yes, thank you, Carolyn, and thanks everyone for attending today. We hope it was informative and useful to you, and I think you have all the contact information from the presenters. And if you have any questions for me, you can email me at fox@scag.ca.gov. And again, thank you for attending, and I think we can wrap up and adjourn.